The quiet in Anna's life was something she had built, piece by piece, like a fortress against the world. It was a careful construction of solitude, a life lived on her own terms, where the loudest sound was often the gentle hum of her refrigerator, or the soft rustle of a turning page. This piece was her most prized possession, earned through years of navigating a world that often felt too loud, too demanding. Her apartment was her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside was kept firmly at bay. She arranged her days with precision, each hour accounted for, each activity designed to maintain the serene equilibrium she so cherished. But then, the quiet was broken. It started as a faint, piercing wail from the apartment next door, a sound that sliced through the calm she had so meticulously curated. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was temporary, a fleeting disruption that would soon pass. She would turn up her music, put on her headphones, or even leave the apartment for long walks, hoping to return to the silence she craved. But the crying was persistent, a relentless tide of infant sorrow that seemed to have no end. It became the soundtrack to her days, and, more maddeningly, her nights, seeping through the walls and into her very being. The calls to the police began out of a sense of desperation, a last resort to reclaim her stolen peace. The first time, she felt a pang of guilt, but that feeling quickly faded with each subsequent night of interrupted sleep. It was the third call in a single month. The noise wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it felt like an invasion, an assault on her right to a peaceful existence. To her, the constant crying was a sign of neglect, a problem that needed to be addressed by someone in authority. She imagined a scenario of carelessness, never once considering the story that might be unfolding on the other side of the wall, a story far more complex than she could have guessed. She explained her frustration to the dispatcher with a practiced weariness. "It's the baby again," she would say, her voice tight with annoyance. "It never stops. Surely something must be wrong." Each call reinforced her belief that she was the victim, the one whose life was being unfairly disrupted. The sound was a mystery she didn't care to solve, only to silence. The person responsible, the parent of this child, was a faceless source of her misery. She didn't know him, and she felt no obligation to. Her world was her own, and he was an unwelcome intruder in it, one she wished would simply disappear, taking the endless noise with him. On the other side of that wall lived a young man named Alex, and his world was the opposite of quiet. It was a chaotic landscape of half-empty baby bottles, piles of unwashed laundry, and the relentless, heartbreaking cries of his 5-month-old son, Leo. Alex was a single father, adrift in an ocean of responsibility he was barely navigating. The baby's mother had left 2 months earlier, her departure as sudden and final as a slammed door, leaving behind a silence that was quickly filled by the needs of a tiny, helpless human. He had no family to call, no parents to lean on, no one to share the crushing weight of it all. He worked from home, a job that once offered freedom but now felt like an impossible balancing act. He would type emails with one hand while desperately trying to rock a fussy Leo with the other. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, a distant memory from another lifetime. He moved through his days in a fog of exhaustion, his mind a blur of deadlines and feeding schedules. He would look at his son, this small person who depended on him for everything, and feel a surge of love so powerful it terrified him. But that love was tangled with a profound sense of inadequacy. "I barely know what I'm doing," he confessed to himself in the darkest hours of the night. The police officer who knocked on his door was not the first. Alex opened it with a familiar sense of dread and shame. The officer's eyes took in the scene, the exhaustion etched onto Alex's face, the disarray of the apartment, the crying infant in his arms. But instead of accusation, the officer's voice was gentle. He asked questions, and Alex, too tired to pretend, let the story spill out. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the loneliness, the overwhelming fear that he was failing his son. He explained that he was doing his best, but his best never seemed to be enough to bring peace to his small, fractured world. The officer listened, not as a symbol of authority, but as a man who understood struggle. He saw not a negligent father, but a young man drowning, trying to keep his head above water for the sake of his child. The messy apartment wasn't a sign of carelessness, it was a testament to his battle, a physical manifestation of a life consumed by the singular, all-encompassing task of keeping a baby alive, and cared for, all on his own. The officer saw the love in Alex's tired eyes, the fierce determination to keep going, even when every part of him wanted to collapse. It was a story not of failure, but of a desperate, lonely fight. After leaving Alex's apartment, the officer walked back to Anna's door. He had a choice. He could file the report, mark it as another noise complaint, and let the cycle continue. That was the job after all, resolve the immediate issue and move on. But something about the raw exhaustion in the young father's eyes stayed with him. He had seen two people, isolated by a single wall, both suffering in their own way. He recognized that the problem wasn't just the noise, it was the space between them, a space filled with assumptions and silence, a space where compassion had not yet been allowed to grow. When Anna opened the door, her expression was one of impatient expectation. She was ready to hear that the problem had been handled, that a warning had been issued. But the officer didn't offer a simple resolution. Instead, he began to paint a picture for her, using quiet words to describe the scene he had just witnessed. He told her about the young, single father, the mother who had left, the absence of any family or support. He spoke of a man trying to work from home while caring for a baby, a man who was utterly and completely alone in his struggle. He was trying to give the noise a human face. "That's not my concern," Anna said, her voice sharp, her defenses immediately up. Her peace was her priority, and the reasons for its disruption felt irrelevant. It was a line she had drawn, a boundary to protect her own well-being. But the officer didn't back down. He looked at her, not with judgment, but with a simple, profound suggestion that would hang in the air long after he left. "I understand," he said calmly. "But maybe instead of calling us, you could offer a little help." The words were unexpected, a challenge to the world she had built around herself. He then added a thought that struck at the heart of the matter. "I don't even know him," Anna had said earlier, as if that explained everything. The officer gently turned this fact on its head. "And that might be the real issue," he replied. His visit was no longer about a noise complaint. It was about community, about connection, about the simple human decency of looking beyond our own walls to see the person struggling on the other side. He left Anna standing in her doorway, the silence of her apartment now filled not with the sound of a crying baby, but with the echo of his question. For the next week, the officer's words replayed in Anna's mind. They were an unwelcome guest in her carefully ordered thoughts, disrupting her routine just as much as the crying had. She felt a prickle of guilt, a feeling she tried to push away with justifications. It wasn't her responsibility. She had her own life, her own problems. Why should she be the one to step in? She had worked hard for her solitude, for her peace, and the idea of voluntarily walking into the chaos next door felt like a betrayal of herself. She tried to busy herself, to drown out the nagging voice of her conscience with work and errands. Then, one evening, the crying started again. It was a familiar sound, but this time, it landed differently. It was no longer just an anonymous noise, it was the sound of Leo, the 5-month-old son of Alex, the exhausted young father who was all alone. She could picture the scene the officer had described, the messy room, the tired man, the helpless baby. The crying was no longer an irritation, it was a signal of distress, a broadcast of a struggle happening just a few feet away. She felt a knot of guilt tighten in her stomach. She did nothing, but doing nothing now felt like a conscious, heavy choice. She sat in her silent living room, the wails from next door seeming to grow louder with each passing minute. Her hand reached for her phone on the coffee table. The familiar motion of dialing the police was almost automatic, a reflex born of weeks of frustration. Her thumb hovered over the call button. It would be so easy. It was the path she knew, the one that kept her safely on her side of the wall, away from the mess and the heartache of someone else's life. But she hesitated. The officer's question echoed in her ears. "Maybe you could offer a little help." With a deep breath, she put the phone down. The decision felt monumental, as if she were standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the familiar, isolated comfort of her own world. The other path led to a closed door, behind which lay an unknown landscape of another person's pain. It was a frightening step to consider. It meant leaving her fortress, dismantling a small piece of the wall she had built around her heart. But for the first time, the silence she craved felt less like peace and more like loneliness. She stood up, her heart pounding, and walked toward her own front door. The short walk from her door to his felt like a journey across a vast, uncertain territory. Each step was filled with doubt. What would she say? What if he was angry? What if he rejected her offer? It was so much easier to be annoyed from a distance, to be an anonymous complainant. To stand face to face was to make it real, to become a character in his story instead of a critic of its soundtrack. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it to knock. The sound of her knuckles on the wood felt unnaturally loud. A stark contrast to the persistent crying that was still audible from within. When the door creaked open, it revealed a scene of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Alex stood there, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollowed out and rimmed with red. He held Leo, who was wailing, his small face scrunched and tear-streaked. Alex didn't look angry or defensive. He just looked defeated, as if the simple act of opening the door had taken every last bit of energy he possessed. He seemed to brace himself for the complaint he was sure was coming, the familiar lecture about the noise. He recognized her as the neighbor who kept calling the police, but the words Anna spoke were not the ones he expected. "I'm your neighbor, Anna," she began, her voice softer than she intended. I heard the baby. It sounds like you're having a hard time. I came to see if you could use some help." The offer hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the divide of their shared wall. For a moment, Alex just stared at her, his exhausted mind struggling to process the kindness in her words. He had been expecting a fight, another battle, in a long and tiring war. Instead, here was a truce. He was too tired to be proud, too overwhelmed to refuse. He simply nodded, a slow, heavy movement, and stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was just as the officer had described it, a landscape of a life in survival mode. But Anna didn't see the mess. She saw the evidence of a father's desperate effort. Her gaze fell on Leo, who was still crying in his father's arms. Without a second thought, she held out her own arms. "Let me try," she said gently. "You look like you need a break. Please, go get some rest." It was a simple offer, but for Alex, it felt like a lifeline. Alex handed his son over to this near stranger, his arms feeling unnaturally light without the familiar weight. He watched as Anna cradled Leo, her movements sure and calm. He had intended to just sit on the couch for a moment, to catch his breath, but the exhaustion he had been holding at bay for weeks, for months, finally washed over him in a great, irresistible wave. He stumbled toward his bedroom, the promise of sleep more powerful than any other force on earth. He didn't even bother to pull back the covers. He collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, and was lost to the world almost instantly. In the living room, Anna held the small crying child. She could feel the tension in his tiny body, the frantic energy that had been fueling his cries. She began to hum a soft, simple tune, a melody from her own childhood that she hadn't thought of in years. As she hummed, she swayed gently, pacing the small room with slow, deliberate steps. She wasn't doing anything magical or complicated. She was simply offering a pocket of calm in a world of chaos. She whispered to the baby, her voice a low murmur, telling him everything was okay. Within minutes, a small miracle occurred. The baby's frantic wails began to soften, subsiding into whimpers, and then into little hiccups. His tense body started to relax in her arms. He seemed to be absorbing the tranquility she was projecting, the peaceful energy she was giving him. He just needed calm, she would later explain. Babies feel the energy we give them. Soon his eyes fluttered closed, his breathing deepened, and he was fast asleep, his tear-stained cheek resting against her shoulder. The silence that filled the apartment was profound, a gentle, peaceful quiet that was a world away from the sterile silence of her own home. 2 hours later, Alex awoke. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. It was a complete and total silence, the likes of which he hadn't experienced since before Leo was born. A jolt of panic shot through him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. He walked out into the living room and found Anna sitting in his armchair, Leo sleeping peacefully on her chest. The sight was so surreal, so impossibly peaceful, that he could only stare. She looked up and gave him a small, gentle smile. In that moment, he felt a flicker of hope, the first he had felt in a very long time. That first act of kindness was not the last. It was the beginning of something new, a crack in the wall of isolation that had separated two lonely people. Anna saw the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that hadn't vanished with one 2-hour nap. She understood that Alex's struggle wasn't a one-time crisis, but an ongoing battle. So, a few days later, she knocked on his door again. This time, she came with a simple proposal. "How about I come over for a couple of hours, twice a week," she offered. "Just to give you a break. You can catch up on sleep or work, or just have a moment to yourself." Alex, humbled and profoundly grateful, accepted without hesitation. Those visits became a sacred ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening Anna would arrive, and the transfer of the baby would happen with a quiet understanding. She would take Leo, and Alex would retreat, sometimes to sleep, sometimes to work without interruption, and sometimes just to sit in another room and breathe. He was slowly recharging, his reserves of energy and patience being refilled, drop by drop. The fog of exhaustion began to lift, and he started to feel like himself again, a person beyond just a tired father. With these regular intervals of peace, the entire atmosphere of the home began to change. Leo, sensing the calm in his father and benefiting from the serene presence of Anna, cried less. The frantic, desperate energy that had filled the apartment was replaced by a gentle rhythm. There were still hard moments, of course, but they were no longer constant. The apartment started to look less like a disaster zone and more like a home. Alex found the strength to clean, to organize, to create a space that felt nurturing for both him and his son. The quiet in their home was no longer a rare, fleeting moment, but a more frequent and welcome guest. During those visits, after Leo was asleep, Anna and Alex would sometimes sit and talk. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, and their quiet disappointments. He told her about his dreams of being a good father, and she told him about the life she had built for herself and the loneliness that sometimes crept into its quiet corners. They were just two people, talking over a sleeping baby, discovering the person on the other side of the wall. They were no longer just neighbors, they were becoming friends, connected by an act of kindness that had blossomed into a genuine, caring bond. The twice-weekly visits slowly, imperceptibly, became more. Anna started bringing over a home-cooked meal, knowing Alex barely had the energy to think about food. Alex would make sure the coffee was ready when she arrived, remembering how she liked it. The small acts of consideration began to stack up, building a foundation of affection and care. The conversations grew longer, stretching beyond the time Leo was asleep. They found they enjoyed each other's company, that the silence between them was no longer awkward or empty, but comfortable and filled with a quiet understanding. The bond that grew between them was not a sudden, dramatic flame. It was a slow, gentle warmth that grew over time, nurtured by shared moments and mutual support. He fell in love with her kindness, with the way she had seen his struggle and met it not with judgment, but with compassion. She fell in love with his resilience, with the fierce love he had for his son, and with the gentle strength she had watched him reclaim. They had met at their lowest points, he in his exhaustion, she in her isolation, and had helped each other find their way back to the light. Years passed. The wall between their apartments was no longer a barrier. They were married, and their home was filled with a new kind of sound. The sound of laughter, of children playing, of a family. They had 2 more children together, and Leo, the baby, whose cries had once driven them apart, was now a big brother. Their home was not the fortress of solitude Anna had once craved, nor the chaotic survival space Alex had once inhabited. It was a place of warmth, noise, and boundless love, a testament to the unexpected path their lives had taken. One evening, Alex sat with Leo, now a curious young boy, and told him the story of how their family began. He told him about the crying, the police calls, and the neighbor who had every right to be angry but chose to be kind instead. He pointed to Anna, who was tucking their youngest child into bed. "She called the police on us," Alex said with a smile, "and then she saved us." It was their origin story, a strange and beautiful tale of how a complaint, transformed by compassion, had turned 2 strangers into a family, building a life they never could have imagined. Later that night, as Anna was reading him a bedtime story, Leo looked up at her with thoughtful eyes. The story his father had told him was still turning over in his mind. It was a story that didn't make complete sense to his young mind. He understood love and family, but the beginning of it all, The part about the anger and the police was confusing. He asked her a simple question, the kind of question only a child can ask, one that cuts directly to the heart of everything. "Why did you help us?" he asked. "Dad said you were mad." Anna closed the book and looked at her son, the boy whose cries had once been the bane of her existence, and who was now a cherished part of her heart. How could she explain the profound shift that had happened inside her? How could she describe the journey from annoyance to empathy, from isolation to love? She thought about the officer's words, about her own loneliness, and about the exhausted man she had found on the other side of the door. She realized the answer was both simple and the most important lesson she had ever learned in her life. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead and spoke softly. "Because all of us are fighting something, Leo," she began, her voice full of a gentle wisdom earned through experience. "Your dad was fighting to be a good father all by himself, and I was fighting a different kind of battle, a battle with loneliness." She explained that for a long time, she thought the way to win her battle was to build walls and keep everyone out. But she learned that true strength and true peace didn't come from pushing people away. "Real kindness," she finished, her words a gift she was passing down to him, "means fighting with people, not against them. It means seeing someone struggle and choosing to stand with them in it, even if it's messy, even if it's hard, even if it disrupts your own quiet life. It means knocking on a door not to complain, but to connect. It is in those moments, in those small courageous acts of empathy, that we find not only our shared humanity, but also the unexpected beginnings of love, family, and a home filled with a beautiful, life-giving noise."